In a cafe where everyday meetings take place, one situation became a true test of humanity. On this day, the barista, without hesitation, loudly humiliated a girl for her appearance, mocking her for being too fat to order coffee with syrup. This was not just a remark. It was a public humiliation that made the girl feel worse than ever. But at that very moment, a twist occurred that changed everything. Keanu Reeves, who was in the cafe, became not just a witness, but a hero who intervened in the situation. His actions will make you reconsider how important it is to support each other and respect personal boundaries. He not only held the barista accountable, but also did something that could teach us all an important lesson about the true power of kindness and support. The morning in the cafe was calm, as usual. The sound of the coffee machine humming, the clink of cups, and the soft murmur of conversations created a typical atmosphere of a busy city cafe. People sat at their tables, sipping their drinks, immersed in their own world. The cafe was filled with the warmth of freshly brewed coffee and the faint smell of pastries. But in one corner of the cafe, there was a woman who wasn't quite at ease. Her face showed a mix of quiet determination and apprehension, as if she was battling an invisible weight. She was just an ordinary customer, but today, she was fighting an internal battle. She had come to the cafe to enjoy a simple cup of coffee with syrup, a small pleasure she had learned to cherish. But something about today felt different. As she stood in line, she fidgeted with her phone, trying to avoid making eye contact with anyone around her. She couldn't help but feel like people were watching her, sizing her up. When her turn came, she approached the counter, her hands slightly trembling as she glanced at the barista. The barista, a young man with a bored expression, briefly acknowledged her presence, but his eyes showed something different, something that felt like judgment. As she placed her order for a coffee with syrup, his gaze flickered over her. Then, without skipping a beat, he delivered his words loud enough for everyone in the cafe to hear. He made a comment about how she probably shouldn't be ordering such a sweet coffee, pointing out that she was probably too fat for syrup anyway. The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. For a moment, everything around her seemed to freeze. The sound of the cafe faded, and all she could hear were those words echoing in her head. The world around her felt distant, and all she could do was stand there, trying to process what had just happened. Her body felt heavy, her heart sinking. Her mind raced, but her hands remained frozen by her side. Her thoughts swirled in confusion, trying to make sense of the harsh words. She stood there for a moment, completely stunned. She had been in this cafe countless times before, but never had she felt so exposed. The heat that usually came with the smell of coffee now felt suffocating. The other customers in the cafe, who had also been standing in line, looked away awkwardly. Some exchanged glances, others just pretended not to notice, but the weight of the silence was suffocating. It was as if the entire cafe had become complicit in this cruel moment. The woman's face turned red, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. She wanted to disappear, to just melt into the floor and never have to face anyone again. She could feel the gazes of the other customers on her, each one seemingly piercing through her skin, judging her. She wanted to say something to defend herself, but the words caught in her throat. She had no idea how to fight back against the humiliation she was feeling. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She briefly looked around the cafe, hoping someone would speak up, but no one did. The barista didn't seem to care, as he busied himself with making another coffee. She glanced at the people sitting at their tables, pretending nothing was happening, but she could feel their stares weighing on her. It was as if she had become a spectacle for their amusement, a target for ridicule. Her hands shook as she clutched her purse, her fingers digging into the leather. She was on the verge of tears, but fought to hold them back. She didn't want to cry in front of them, in front of all these strangers who had just witnessed the cruelest thing. For a brief moment, she considered leaving, walking out of the cafe, and never coming back. Her coffee, which she had been so excited to enjoy, suddenly seemed like something she didn't deserve. But before she could make that decision, she noticed the barista's sneer. He was still smirking at her, his face full of pride, as if he had done nothing wrong. He turned his attention to the next customer, dismissing her completely. The woman stood there for what seemed like an eternity. She could feel her pulse quicken as the embarrassment washed over her in waves. She thought about her own reflection, her body, and the harsh judgment she had just received. For a brief moment, she wanted to scream, to let out the anger and frustration that had been building inside her. But all she could do was turn away, grab her coffee, and walk to a corner of the cafe. Her hands were trembling as she tried to calm herself, but the sting of humiliation didn't go away. She sat down at a table in the corner, her shoulders slumped and her gaze directed downward. Her coffee sat in front of her, cold and unappealing. She had no appetite. She had no desire to enjoy the simple pleasure she had come for. All she could think about was what had just happened. The cafe, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison. The woman's face was flushed, and her body language screamed defeat. She had tried so hard to ignore the judgment, to find solace in her own self-worth. But in that moment, the words of the barista shattered that illusion. The moment was over, but the impact lingered. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. As she sat there, silently trying to regain her composure, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had to change. She couldn't let this moment define her. She wouldn't let someone else's cruelty take away her confidence. But the road ahead seemed long and difficult, and she didn't know if she had the strength to face it alone. At that moment, as the tension in the cafe seemed to reach its peak, a shift occurred. From a table near the corner, a figure stood up. It was Keanu Reeves. He had been quietly observing the interaction between the barista and the woman, his face showing subtle concern. His calm demeanor stood in stark contrast to the chaotic energy surrounding him. Without a second thought, Keanu stood up, his movements smooth and deliberate, and began walking toward the counter. His expression remained composed, his pace steady but unhurried. As he approached the woman, who was now sitting at a corner table, still shaken from the harsh words, he made no attempt to draw attention to himself. His presence, however, commanded the room. The hum of the cafe seemed to fade, as if the universe itself paused to take note of his every step. Keanu, with his characteristic gentleness, approached her quietly, his body language radiating reassurance. There was no need for loud words or forceful gestures. Keanu's approach was as soft as it was firm, and he simply offered her a moment of solace by suggesting she sit down beside him. His eyes met hers with a deep, kind understanding. There was no judgment in his gaze, only compassion. His presence was like a soothing balm for the pain and discomfort she had just endured. The air around them, once tense and filled with discomfort, now seemed to change. His calmness had the power to diffuse the tension, and in that small, silent gesture, a shift began to happen. She looked up at him, her expression confused at first, as if trying to process the sudden change in atmosphere. But there was something in his demeanor that made her feel safe again, something that reminded her of her own worth. The barista, still standing at the counter, could only watch as Keanu's calmness seemed to affect everyone in the cafe. The woman, who had once felt so small and insignificant, began to straighten her back. Her shoulders, which had been weighed down with the burden of humiliation, started to relax. Keanu's gentle act of kindness had restored her sense of dignity. The cafe around them continued its hustle and bustle, but in that moment, all eyes seemed to be on the two of them. The woman, once overwhelmed by the cruelty of the situation, now found a renewed sense of strength. It wasn't just Keanu's words that made a difference, but his very presence. His ability to step in at a moment of injustice and offer quiet support spoke volumes about the kind of person he was. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. There were no grand gestures or dramatic speeches. But in a world that often feels too busy to care, his simple act of empathy was a reminder of what true kindness and respect look like. Keanu remained by her side for a moment, and his silent support gave her the strength she needed to feel human again, to feel seen and valued. As he stood there, just beside her, the rest of the cafe seemed to watch, not in judgment, but in quiet reflection. For the first time that morning, she felt as if the world had stopped for a brief moment, allowing her to catch her breath. She could almost feel the weight of her self-doubt lifting as she shared this moment with Keanu. For a moment, time itself seemed to slow down. The harsh words of the barista, once so jarring, seemed to dissipate into the air, replaced by the warmth that Keanu brought. His subtle power didn't need to be announced. It was felt in the quiet reassurance of his presence. And in that shared silence, she realized something. It wasn't about fighting back with anger or words. It was about standing tall, no matter what others said or did. Keanu's actions demonstrated that sometimes true strength comes from simply being present, from offering a helping hand or a kind look when it's needed most. As the quiet moment lingered, the woman finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The barista, who had been the source of her pain only moments ago, now stood a few feet away, awkwardly avoiding eye contact with Keanu. The power dynamics in the room had shifted. The woman, once a victim of ridicule, was now regaining her sense of control, empowered by Keanu's simple, yet profound gesture. And in that moment, she realized she wasn't alone in facing the world's injustices. Keanu had reminded her of the importance of empathy, of kindness, and of standing up for what's right, even when the world doesn't seem to notice. Keanu stood there for a moment, his calm presence filling the space. The air around him seemed to shift. He wasn't a man of loud gestures or anger. Instead, his actions were deliberate, filled with a quiet power that contrasted sharply with the chaotic energy of the cafe. His gaze turned slowly toward the barista, whose face had hardened earlier with arrogance. The barista, who had mocked the woman moments ago, was now the target of a quiet but firm scrutiny. Keanu's eyes locked with the barista's, and for a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. The cafe, which had once been buzzing with conversation and laughter, fell into a hushed silence. Every patron in the cafe, whether aware of what had transpired or not, could sense the shift in the atmosphere. Keanu's steady, composed gaze sent an unmistakable message. He wasn't going to let this go. Without raising his voice, without a single hint of aggression, Keanu spoke with the kind of authority that only comes from a deep sense of respect for humanity. His words weren't loud, but they carried weight. The barista stood frozen, a slight quiver in his hands as his face drained of color. His posture, once rigid with an air of superiority, collapsed under the quiet force of Keanu's presence. The realization of what he had done, of how he had treated someone with such disrespect, washed over him like a cold wave. The patrons around them, who had been passive observers until now, were slowly becoming aware of the deeper meaning of what was unfolding. Some of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting between Keanu and the barista. The quiet whispers began, and the realization was dawning on them. They had witnessed something important, something that transcended the ordinary, everyday interactions they had grown accustomed to. Keanu didn't need to demand an apology from the barista. The man's shame was already evident. His head hung lower as Keanu's words cut through the air. The barista's failure to acknowledge the woman's dignity was not just a mistake. It was a moment that needed to be publicly recognized. Keanu wasn't asking for public humiliation. He simply wanted the barista to understand the impact of his actions. And through his calm, collected words, that lesson was being imparted not just to the barista, but to everyone who was listening. The silence in the cafe stretched, but it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of awkwardness. It was the heavy, still silence of reflection. The barista's earlier smugness, which had been evident in his every word and gesture, was now replaced with a palpable sense of discomfort. He stood there, unable to look Keanu in the eye, his confidence shattered. Keanu, still standing tall and composed, didn't need to say anything more. His message was clear. He wasn't angry. He wasn't seeking revenge. His simple presence had exposed the cruel behavior for what it was, unacceptable. There was no need for Keanu to raise his voice, for the simple truth of the moment spoke louder than any words could. As the barista silently retreated, some of the customers exchanged glances, processing the significance of what had just occurred. The woman, once crushed by the barista's words, sat up straighter in her chair. She could feel the weight of the room shift from judgment to support. She wasn't alone. Keanu had made sure of that. His actions had given her the strength to stand tall again. The lesson that had been taught in that brief, quiet exchange would stay with everyone who had witnessed it. The cafe, which had felt so cold and indifferent just moments ago, now had a warmth about it. People shifted in their seats, some nodding in quiet agreement with what had just transpired. Keanu's quiet intervention had brought humanity back into a space where it had been sorely lacking. It was a reminder that kindness and respect weren't just ideals. They were actions that could change the course of someone's day or even their life. Keanu didn't linger. He had done what needed to be done, and now it was time for him to leave. He walked back to the counter, his movements smooth and effortless, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. But the truth was, something extraordinary had just taken place. He had stood up for what was right, and in doing so, he had reminded everyone present of the importance of treating others with dignity. As Keanu left the cafe, the woman, who had once felt small and insignificant, now sat with a quiet smile on her face. She didn't feel ashamed anymore. The barista's words had been harsh, but Keanu's actions had restored her belief in herself. She looked at the people around her, who were still talking in hushed tones, and she knew that this was a moment she would never forget. Keanu hadn't just intervened on her behalf. He had reminded her that she was worthy of respect and kindness, just like everyone else. And as Keanu walked out of the cafe, he left behind more than just the memory of a quiet confrontation. He left behind a moment of transformation for the people who had witnessed it. It wasn't just about calling out bad behavior. It was about teaching everyone in that room what it meant to be human. And in that quiet, powerful moment, he had reminded them all that kindness and respect were the most powerful tools we have to change the world around us. After the barista had walked away, the tension in the cafe began to lift, and the air, once thick with discomfort, grew lighter. The woman, still sitting at her table, allowed a quiet breath, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. Keanu's intervention had done more than just stop the barista's cruel remarks. It had reasserted her dignity in a way words alone could not. The weight of her embarrassment and shame, which had been so heavy only moments ago, began to dissipate as she processed the kindness he had shown her. Keanu, without hesitation, returned to her table. His demeanor was warm, but still composed. He didn't need to say much, but the way he sat down next to her made all the difference. His presence was not just comforting, but empowering. He looked at her, offering not just a moment of reprieve from the cruelty she'd experienced, but also a reminder that she didn't have to accept other people's judgments. His calm, respectful gaze said everything. She was seen, and she was valued for who she was, not for how others perceived her. Keanu didn't offer empty platitudes. His words were simple, but they resonated deeply. He told her that she should never feel ashamed of her preferences, her body, or how she chose to live her life. It wasn't just about the coffee with syrup. It was about claiming her space in the world without fear or self-doubt. Keanu's gentle but firm reminder that her worth was intrinsic, unaffected by external judgments, became a turning point in her perception of herself. As she absorbed his words, she felt a surge of confidence she hadn't known in a long time. In that small but significant moment, she realized that her value wasn't defined by the criticism of others, especially strangers who didn't know her. The attack on her self-esteem had been an isolated moment of cruelty, but Keanu's kindness reminded her of her strength. She wasn't just the target of ridicule. She was someone worthy of respect, dignity, and kindness. It wasn't a grand gesture, but the change it brought to her sense of self was monumental. Keanu, having spoken his piece and ensured she felt empowered, stood up and moved toward the exit. His movements were smooth, effortless, and his presence lingered in the air like a quiet reminder of the importance of humanity. He didn't look for acknowledgement or gratitude, but as he walked away, He left behind a trail of warmth and quiet respect that seemed to infuse the room. In the cafe, things began to settle into their usual rhythm again. The background noise of clinking cups and low chatter slowly returned, but the atmosphere had subtly shifted. People around the cafe, who had witnessed the moment unfold, couldn't help but reflect on the powerful exchange they had just witnessed. It wasn't just about the confrontation with the barista. It was about the greater message Keanu had imparted. Kindness, respect, and empathy were the true measures of a person's character. His actions had called attention to the way society often lets cruelty slide by without consequence. Keanu had shown them all what it looked like to be truly human. The woman, still sitting at the table, looked around the room, her eyes briefly meeting Keanu's as he made his way to the door. She silently thanked him, not with words but with a soft smile that carried the gratitude she couldn't express verbally. Her confidence, which had been shattered by the barista's words, was now fully restored. It wasn't just the moment of intervention that had done it. It was the understanding that she had someone in her corner, someone who believed in her worth even when the world didn't. She no longer felt ashamed or small. Keanu had given her something far more valuable than just a public reprimand to the barista. He had given her the strength to stand tall again. As Keanu exited the cafe, the patrons who had witnessed the event began to exchange knowing glances. The moment hadn't just impacted the woman, it had changed them too. The barista, still standing at the counter, now looked uneasy, his earlier smugness replaced by a faint recognition of the consequences of his actions. He couldn't unhear Keanu's words, couldn't ignore the ripple effect of his behavior. It was a reminder to him, and to everyone who had witnessed the exchange, that kindness wasn't optional. It was a responsibility. The woman finished her coffee, but the taste of the drink now felt different. It was no longer about the syrup or the judgment she'd faced. It was about the quiet triumph of regaining her sense of self. She left the cafe that day not just with a cup of coffee in hand, but with a renewed belief in herself, strengthened by the unexpected kindness of a stranger who understood the power of respect and empathy. She would never forget the moment when, with a simple act of decency, Keanu had reminded her of her worth. And in the days to come, when life would inevitably test her again, she would carry that moment with her, knowing that she had the strength to stand up for herself, just as he had stood up for her.